atmosphere where the general public is encouraged to assume the worst about judges, and how should we be responding? There has been a shift of control in the courts, and there has in the past been pushback against prior shifts and effort to impeach Earl Warren. On the other hand, it's my sense that even Earl Warren did not have protesters outside of his house, and that he and other members of the court were able to lead a normal life. And so many of us has been watching this with a sort of disbelief. How did we get to this place where the discourse has become so debased and kind of gross, and what can we do about it? What should any of us be doing to try to protect public confidence in the rule of law? I am really, really excited to have Megan McArdle with us tonight to guide the conversation through the panel and the fireside chat. Megan is a columnist for the Washington Post, as you all should know. She previously wrote for The Economist, The Atlantic, and Newsweek. Her columns are themselves a lovely respite from hardened team discourse and offer an unexpected angle that's not easily pigeonholed, so if you are not reading them, you should. I will turn this over to Megan to begin the panel conversation. Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our great panel here. We have Jay Edelson, Nicole Garnett, and James Burnham, and we are going to be talking tonight about attacks on the court, whether we're facing a legitimacy crisis, which, look, I am not a lawyer, I should say. I think probably the only person in this room who's not a lawyer. And so I look at this from the outside, and what I see is a will to undermine the courts without necessarily thinking through what happens after that. And so that's the problem we're gonna try to get at, and we're gonna start just by asking, are we risking a crisis of legitimacy on the courts? And if so, how did we get here?
So yeah, I mean, I can go first. So I think the answer is that it's a totally manufactured crisis of legitimacy, and one that we've never seen something like this in my lifetime. It's an incredibly well-funded, well-planned attack on the Supreme Court as an institution, with all different facets, from social media to advertising to paid protesters to everything, to attack and undermine the justices for everything they've done and things they haven't done. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not an institution that is designed to withstand this sort of sustained political attack. Each justice, other than the Chief Justice, only has 3 permanent staff. And none of them are communications experts, none of them are campaign consultants. These are not political people. You know, Justice Barrett was a law professor. Justice Gorsuch was an appellate court judge. It is not an institution that was built to be under sustained political attack year after year to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars. And so that is something that I find extraordinary and unbelievably dangerous. And we can talk more about the specifics, but I don't think people fully have reckoned with how dangerous what they are doing is, because as soon as the court's ability to enforce the law and to be respected as the final expositor of the law is gone, the instability that we're going to have at the federal level, at the state level, and even potentially in private disputes is almost impossible to overstate. And I think that's very bad and quite dangerous.
Well, so we're going to talk more in a minute about what the consequences are. But let me try to offer the argument from the people I know who welcome the attacks on the court and see them as just. And their argument would be, yes, it's true, justices didn't used to be political people, but now they are. This court is an unprecedented political actor in a way that was not true in previous years. And and they are undermining themselves. It's not that we're doing something to them, it is that they have done it.
So I would say that that's just nonsense. I mean, look, think about the Warren Court. There's a funny story that Eugene Volokh, who many of us had a fake cert pool petition about Gideon versus Wainwright. And it was the question about whether a person had the right to paid counsel as a criminal defendant. And the cert petition, the fake petition pool said something like some kind of half-baked substantive due process claim, splitless, meritless, fact-bound deny. If you clerks on the court, that was funny, but maybe don't. But in the end, I thought it was funny. Anyway, so the courts, this court is so much less political. It's not making stuff up. It's just applying a formalist procedural rules that is resulting in people that don't, the results that people don't like it. And I think that's fine. There's a big difference between deciding that we don't like the outcome of decision X and saying the court is illegitimate. I literally think this is like the most seriously principled court that we've seen in many years. This is not a court that's trying to make political decisions. It's actually a court that's trying to just apply rules that come up with outcomes. And sometimes the court will, the justice will like it, and sometimes they won't.
Well, let me try to summon my inner court critic again and ask, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe they are just applying rules. I think there are, I am not a lawyer, and I am not going to try to argue with a law professor about whether this is true. But, you know, the court is more ideological than it was. Right? I mean, I know
more
that
ideological. It's less ideological. They're just applying rules. Earl Warren is far more ideological than Amy Barrett.
Well, I guess I would say this, and again, I'm now summoning my incredibly weak command of famous cases, but when I look at a case like Roe or like Becky, they are obviously less rule-bound, right? They're sort of summoned from the inner emotional state of the judge writing them, I guess is the best way to put it.
They're just made up.
Summoned from the inner emotional state. But that's a little, you know, there's more kind of room to try to compromise with how the public feels and feel out how elites think about this and come up with a kind of rough compromise that keeps the peace in a way that when you are applying a hard rule consistently, you might be more consistent, but you are also actually less able to keep this from tripping into political controversies.
Do you think that's an accurate description of Roe versus Wade?
So I don't understand. I literally, James
Emanations and penumbras.
Yeah, so why is it that, go ahead.
So,
you know, Jay, I want to bring you in.
yeah,
I'm
that's
sorry,
okay.
we've-
So I come at this from, please, I don't want any tomatoes or booze yet.
Right.
Center-left position, someone who liked a lot of the kind of policy judgments that were underlying some of the older Supreme Court cases. I do view there to be kind of a unique crisis. I don't think that it's unprecedented. I think really what makes it unique, so there's always been attacks on the court. Back Thomas Jefferson, you know, let's impeach this person.
Impeach Earl Warren, right?
Yeah, yeah, the court packing of FDR.
Yeah.
I think somewhat outlandish attacks during the nomination process. I mentioned Thomas, and I think you said it started with, oh my goodness, Bork. But in my mind, you know, that's when I was conscious during Thomas, and so that's where my history starts.
We were both in college.
Yes, yes. So I was actually awake at that point. And I only learned recently that you can actually read books and found out what happened before. So that's been helpful. So I think partly what's unique is that we're in a soundbite era. So it's very easy to say this vice presidential candidate is weird. And then that gets put on Twitter and TikTok and just repeated, and that's what people hear. In terms of whether this court is more kind of rule-bound than the Warren Court or other courts, my view is it depends on who you ask. You know, as someone who is pro-choice, yes, Roe v. Wade is thin the word. You know, I've only gotten part of the way through the Constitution. I'm not yet at the part where they talk about trimesters.
Is that the end?
It's at the end,
Yeah.
footnote. But I know it's coming, and I'm excited for that. So I understand that, and I also understand people saying, well, we've really liked having this right, and when it's taken away from us, that feels like activism. And both sides can accuse each other of activism. What I agree with everybody else is there's something different going on. It's not just at the Supreme Court level, but of kind of these personal attacks shouting down when Judge Ho goes and speaks at a law school, whether you agree with him or not. What an opportunity to listen to him and speak to him. And the extreme, what I view as kind of the extreme woke left, doesn't believe in that anymore. It's just let's shout everybody down and let's put social pressure. And that's what's changed, and that is not a good thing for our democracy.
It's interesting that you talk about social media, because I think that has to be a big part of it, right? I remember, so I was kind of a lefty in college for a bit, and I used to go to protests, and because I went to school in Philadelphia, it's a large media market centered on a pretty small city. And so the great part was you could go to a protest, and then if you ran home, you could watch yourself on television.
Oh.
And I remember going to a pro-choice protest where I think there were like 20 people in the march, but they had filmed it because it was a slow news day. They'd filmed it so that it looked like there were hundreds of women converging on downtown Philadelphia. And I think that's part of it, right, is I know about all of these controversies. I know about all of these shouting downs that I would not know about if it were 20 years ago. I wouldn't know who Judge Ho was, probably. I'm sure that that's bad. Apologies, but I don't normally write about the law, and that the fact that you can go viral, but also get the idea from other people who are going viral, does that would this? I take the point that it goes back to Bork, that there is a long and incredibly poisonous game of tit for tat that has now been going on for 30, 40 years. But would it have been so bad if it weren't for the internet? Is this something that has given people tools to undermine the court in a way that was not possible before?
So just to be clear, I don't think there's been a tit for tat, or it's been a lot of tats, because the people in this room have never tried to destroy the life of a nominee to the Supreme Court from the other party. That has never happened. It has not happened before Kavanaugh. It has not happened after Kavanaugh. Do I think the internet facilitates it? Sure. But I think actually a much bigger culprit of it is what people commonly describe or call the mainstream media. And the idea that the New York Times or the Washington Post will take seriously the most ludicrous, unsubstantiated, ridiculous allegations in the world. And I don't just mean Ford. I mean Julie Swetnick, the one who said that Brett Kavanaugh was wearing his Georgetown prep uniform, dumping Quaaludes into a punch bowl somewhere in Maryland, sometime in the 80s. Which was treated as a serious allegation. Every Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, including Kamala Harris, signed a letter that he should withdraw in light of the Swetnick allegations. That was treated as a serious story. That is different. I don't think when Justice Thomas went through his process, it was this bad. It was certainly not this bad when I was a high school kid. It is a new thing. It's a big problem. And maybe that's reinforced by the internet and sort of the feedback loop that reporters live in where they sort of read their followers. But I think the total abandonment of journalistic neutrality at sort of mainstream institutions is a huge culprit.
So as a Thomas clerk, I think what Justice Thomas went through in the nominee was awful. So I'm going to put that out there.
I agree.
It was terrible. So I think there's a couple of things going on here. The first is, the fear of saying, maybe even entering this process. We want people who are really highly qualified, like some of the people in this room. I'm looking at you, Greg Cassis, to agree to go through this process, right?
Greg doesn't even know what a Quaalude is.
We really want good people to agree to go through this process. And the situation in the confirmation it's a chilling effect on people deciding to do this. It's awful. And then the second thing I will say is even if you get confirmed, it's still awful. People are trying to kill the justices. I'm sorry. Maybe it's gotten better, but we have folks, protesting outside of the justices' houses day on day and having to drive your children to school in armored cars. It is just a terrible situation. It's not just the confirmation process, which, as James points out, is bad, but it really has become this actual life and death situation that I don't think we should dismiss lightly.
I think the question is, though, how does the confirmation process start setting up the later arguments? Because if you can kill someone's credibility, you make them into some just lunatic fringe person, then as the time goes by, it's easier for a lot of people to say, oh, they're just making political decisions. And I don't want to say that that is a strategy by the Democrats, because what binds the Democratic Party is that we have no strategy at all. But that is, I think, what happens, where, James, I agree with you that the attacks on conservative nominees are different than the attacks on liberal or moderate nominees. It's not something I'd focused on before, and that's not a good thing. And your Democrats are going to say, but how about Merrick Garland? You know, I'm just saying, we can go back and forth the whole time. To me, the only way to solve this is by thinking about, what if the people who don't align with me control the Supreme Court? What do I want the rules to be? Now, the people who are aligned with me control the Supreme Court. What do I want the rules to be? And what everyone in a constitutional democracy should agree with is, look, ever since Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court is the last decider. And if they're not going to be seen as credible, then who's going to be the decider?
So we'll get to consequences later. We got an order here, people. You guys are being too interesting and rushing ahead. So let me haul back and ask. You know, we've already heard some, right? We've heard the Thomas case. Let me name some of the cases that, to me as an outsider, seem like the big cases. And I want to talk about the relative importance and the relative effects of those cases. So one is obviously the ethics investigations that you've seen from ProPublica. One was the Kavanaugh hearing. And I was really struck, even for me. I was one of two vaguely right-leaning columnists who was kind of in the middle. I just said, look, it is impossible to know whether this happened or not, right? All of the details are bad. I completely agree with you, by the way, that I was one of the people who, I wrote a column actually criticizing the New Yorker quite heavily. I thought that the second accusation was irresponsible. It was very clear from if you know anything about kind of how testimony and eyewitness testimony and memory works, that just from her own account, that by the time she had memories, by the time she came forward, there was a good chance her memories were confabulated. She had been talking to people about it for months. She didn't initially know whether it had been him. And I think, you know, it can be totally sincere. Confabulation of memories is not something that people do deliberately to be bad people. It can be a very sincere thing. I once convinced my sister as an experiment that Mickey Mouse had punched me at Disney World, and I got her to remember it, and we never went to Disney World because my parents don't love me.
Were you ever punched by Mickey Mouse?
No, I've never been to Disney World, never been punched by Mickey Mouse. And so, you know, I thought that they should not have printed that, and I thought that the Julie Swetnick accusations were obviously ludicrous and I mean, look, if you have photographs, fine, but that should not have gone into a media report unless you had better corroboration than a random person who says that she saw him waiting in line. But that said, right, what I was surprised about was how radicalizing that was for so many people I knew, that was the moment at which they started getting angry at me for voting for Kamala Harris, which I am, please don't throw tomatoes.
We're going to persuade you otherwise in the next hour.
Good luck with that. But so I saw people just lose it in a way that I had not seen it before. They were so angry about what happened to Brett Kavanaugh precisely because it was a character attack, precisely because there's no way to refute it. This thing that happened 35 years ago, I remember it. You know, how do I prove that didn't happen? That an unidentified thing at a time when I was 16 years old didn't happen? There is no way. And it terrified people that this is the future of the court. And I think we have it. The good news is we have not seen that since. But that, to me, stands out as potentially the worst. But there are other candidates. There's the Thomas hearing. There is the incredible interest in Mrs. Alito's flag choice. And which of these attacks, and there is the violence. Which of these attacks are the most dangerous, in your opinion?
So,
I'm going to ask each of you to say. And
yeah.
what are the consequences of that?
I mean, it's hard to pick a worst one. I mean, I was there for the Kavanaugh process. I was back to the White House and worked on the confirmation. And I think part of why it was so radicalizing is, I mean, for those who know Justice Kavanaugh, he is about the most mild-mannered, nice, upstanding, least likely guy to be caught up in a Quaalude ring of pretty much anybody I know. And so it really demonstrated that they can make up anything about anyone and have it treated as though it is credible, and have people who are engaged in motivated reasoning immediately adopt it and call you a rapist for the rest of your life because somebody that you may or may not have ever met in high school, because by the way, there's not any evidence that they actually met. There's some evidence that they were in the same city at the same time, probably, can come up out of nowhere and make this accusation. And by the way, when it happened, you know, Ford sent her letter to Dianne Feinstein, who, to her credit, recognized that this was not a legitimate allegation. She sat on the letter. The letter came in over the summer. The BI process doesn't even go back before age 18, because there's long been a recognition that stuff in high school, absent extraordinary circumstances, is not relevant to whether you can serve as a federal judge. And she pocketed it. Now, it got around to other staffers on the committee. I forget which senator staffers, other people know, it's probably been reported, who then put it out to the press, first through The Intercept and then through Emma Brown at the Washington Post. And then, you know, everyone knows what happened after that. I think that's unbelievably dangerous, because you have now convinced, through basically no evidence, half the country that Brett Kavanaugh is a rapist. There's a direct through line from that process to a man with a gun coming into his backyard to try to kill him and maybe his family, which happened. And, you know, but for the grace of God, that could have been a true national catastrophe and a personal catastrophe for him. The stuff with Justice Alito's wife is also horrible. This is a private person who was hanging a flag, upside-down flag, or the flag with the tree that no one had ever heard of until it became a January 6th symbol in the New York Times. You know, that's really bad stuff, because it convinces the crazy people out there that these are evil people. And that's the kind of thing that gets people killed.
Nicole, you have a lot of thoughts on this, I know, and I would love to hear them.
Well, so I think I was a senior in college when the Anita Hill thing happened, and I think I might have been the only person on the Stanford campus who publicly defended now Justice Thomas in the Stanford newspaper. But look, what is more dangerous? I mean, there's so many levels of danger here. I just think we should recognize, I mean, false accusations, dangerous. Just life, reputation ruining accusations, horrible. What does it do to the judiciary, not just the judiciary, all of the confirmation process, if people are afraid that someone might make stuff up about them? And I think this stuff is made up. But I mean, Megan, you said what's more dangerous. I mean, more dangerous is what's happening right now. And I do think we should probably get into the questions about court reform and whether we should have term limits. But these people's lives are being made a living hell, and they're afraid for their lives. They're afraid they can't drive their kids to school without an armed guard. They can't go to church without an armed guard, without people packing in the church. And I think that is dangerous. It's very, very bad. And I think what James mentions is the straight line. Once we just decide it's all nonsense and it's just all politics, then people have to go to church with armed guards, and they can't take their kids to school when they're not in an armored vehicle. And that is awful for the people that have to do these jobs, and it's going to deter other people from doing them in the future.
And I think, you know, if you also imagine what would have happened if Kavanaugh had been killed.
Biden would have replaced him as fast as he possibly could with a liberal nominee. And then more of them would have gotten killed.
And then, right, so this is the other danger, right? What does this do to the larger, I take the point about the fact who wants to do this job. It's terrible. You have to spend your whole life not saying anything so that you can get the job. And then you have to spend the rest of your life hiding in your house so that you can keep it. Jay, what thoughts do you have? You were looking very active over there.
Was I?
In a good way.
That's how I got my A minuses in law school, by looking active. I see this from kind of the outside looking in. First, there are attacks on judges from both sides. President Trump goes after every single judge and goes after them personally. And I think it's totally fair to say, look, there are political prosecutions going on, but that's different from saying, I think one of the first cases when he was president, it was, this judge is Hispanic, so is going to be against me. That's not a helpful thing. There has been violence against the left, too, by people, who kind of get all ginned up by all this. So to me, and I'm happy to be told I'm wrong about this, the thing that really undermines the credibility of the courts are the ethics attacks. So saying Kavanaugh is a bad person, that gets everyone energized and he shouldn't be on the court, but it doesn't actually go after his judicial philosophy. It just makes the left not like him. When you say Justice Thomas, when you suggest, and it's more than a suggestion, that he's being paid off because he goes on trips with people, that attacks the credibility of the court. Where I struggle with that is the people attacking Justice Thomas are politicians, especially on the left, who, I don't know if anyone knows about this, but they have a way of grabbing some money and, insider trading and all of this stuff. And to me, it's all just complete nonsense. And if someone wanted to do like real reform throughout all the branches of government, that's fine. I actually think with the courts, it should not be the legislative body or the executive branch. I think the court has to be able to police itself. But there's a great part of that, which is whatever people think about a specific court, the justices really do have a deep interest in maintaining its own credibility. So the idea that Justice Roberts isn't going to care about ethics issues at all, and Congress needs to come and start doing things, I think is wrong. And I think it's true on the left too. If the left had the majority, I think that they also would take seriously issues around policing themselves.
So I guess part of the question is, with the level of partisanship, now my understanding is, again, from the outside, that the leaks have actually in some ways been the most poisonous thing, that now no one that there is more of a, no one's going to the opera together anymore. Now it is, they don't trust their colleagues because someone inside the court is leaking and they don't necessarily know who, although I believe they suspect they know who, but they don't know. And that makes it harder, right? All of these things that we're talking about with the legitimacy of the court, fundamentally they are questions of trust. They are questions of living in a high-trust society with high-trust institutions. And, the argument for attacking the court in order to reform it is that, we need to point out their flaws and then, they'll be fixed, it'll be a better court. But is there a way in which this actually undermines your ability to fix the court? Because everything is now so poisonous that even getting that level of trust to come together and make an ethics code that we're all going to abide by and we can all agree on. What do we do about that problem? How do we start rebuilding both trust in the institution and trust of the institution?
Yeah, so I think a critical step is going to be having the political branches, particularly the executive branch, stop pushing on the court as hard as the current administration has done. And the most obvious example of this is the dual indictments in 2 places of the former president and current, potentially future president, and certainly challenger to the current president. One of the 2 indictments, the one in DC, is a very aggressive legal theory. And that has been pushed hard. It has been pushed fast. The notion that Jack Smith is independent from the president is ridiculous to anyone who's worked at the Justice Department and knows how this works. And the entire time, and Jack Smith has gone up to the court. He's asked the court to resolve things on a transparently political timetable. And when the court did so on a very quick timetable in a way that he didn't like, no less than the President of the United States went out to condemn it in front of national television for not letting him imprison his opponent. That sort of stuff is really, really destabilizing. It has never happened in this country before. It's the kind of thing that happens in other countries, and I fear that if the election goes a certain way, it's just going to get worse. Brian Fallon, who some people in here have heard of, was one of the founders of Demand Justice, which was the first dark money group to start really spending serious money trying to destroy the court. He's a senior advisor to the vice president right now. Presumably he'll be in the White House, and they're going to continue. And so I don't know how you're going to be able to rebuild the institution when you have serious political actors doing everything they can to destroy it.
Well, if I can,
sorry.
if I can channel my inner court critic NJ for a moment. I mean, you do have this problem of if Trump is elected, he absolutely will shamelessly attack judges who defy him.
But Megan, what he said, I mean, just saying that guy's a bozo is different, I think, than actually going after the bozo.
I would argue no, but I think he does. He argues that they are illegitimately biased against him, that the court is. And look, I am a critic of the New York cases. I have been dragged by every liberal law professor on Twitter now because I look at the New York cases and I just think, yeah, this kind of looks like you're prosecuting your political opponents. I'm sorry. But the other side of that is that Trump would say that even if that weren't true.
He says a lot of things.
Yeah, so first, we all remember that Trump was saying lock her up, which was the first time I've seen in kind of political history where a presidential candidate was saying that. And I understand, he said a lot of things and he didn't do anything and all of that, but that was not a great moment in our history. I'm very concerned about the criminal charges against Trump, especially the state ones, mostly for procedural reasons, which is that the country is very fractured, and if we have a system where the different states or district attorneys can pick a very conservative or very liberal venue and then say anything about a former president, you can always say someone, I don't know, lied about their taxes or these are all successful people who are involved in so many things. And I think what we've learned so far about the Trump prosecutions is that half the country is going to vote to convict or vote that he's liable regardless of the facts, and half will do the opposite. And that's a really bad thing to have in this country. So I agree. I come out at the point of he did not shoot someone. If he shot someone, that's a different type of thing. A lot of the things that he's alleged to have done were things that were in the past, which no one cared about at the time because he was just a businessman. But now we're going to say he cheated the banks, and we're going to go after him, for that. I think that is just we're on a really bad path, and I don't know what the exit ramp is for that.
Just briefly, the lock her up thing was definitely the chant, but then of course as soon as he won the election, he said, I'm going to let this go. It's bygones be bygones. We're not going to do anything. And the reward he got was the ambush that Comey and others laid for me and other people in the beginning of the administration. I just think there's we talk a lot about norms and democracy. I think there is a fundamental difference between the former, maybe future president tweeting about some judge being a bozo, as Nicole said, and a sustained multi-year campaign involving the president, the legislature, and millions of dollars in political attacks to destroy an institution systematically and methodically. That is 1,000 times more dangerous than anything that Trump has ever done vis-a-vis the court system, and I think ever would do, if only because that level of organization would be quite difficult.
Nicole, I cut you off, so can I bring you in here?
No, I mean, so I think, I do think to your point about, so we should disentangle critiques about opinions we don't like from critiques that are really fundamentally seeking to undermine individual judges, justices, the integrity of the court. So the attacks on Justice Thomas having rich friends. I mean, okay. So, like, there's no, you can't have a quid pro quo if there's no quo. It's just like this constant attack against things that if you scratch the surface, it's actually not about the integrity of the court. It's just a bad look. And so I just think we should think about that when we're talking about these attacks on the court. And it's not, I agree about the lawfare, and it's really bad. But I do feel like, and I don't like the arguments about, well, Breyer went on private planes too.
He really went on a lot of private
He rode on a lot of private planes. I just
How do I get that job? I would like to go on it.
The confirmation
I'm
process is
an
unfortunate.
academic, so I get a lot of boondoggles myself. But I just feel like if we're just the constant personal attacks are really problematic, especially they're unfounded and problematic, and we need to recognize that.
Remember, Justice Thomas, what we were first led to believe was that he wasn't a deep thinker, that he wasn't original, he just followed Scalia, right? This was at the beginning. And then he started with these dissents and concurrences, which have now become the law. And I don't agree with a lot of what he says, but it's hard to say he's not principled. And it's hard to believe that him going on some sort of trip is going to change what is a very kind of well thought out and established, judicial view of how to interpret the Constitution, the statutes, and all of that. So that's my take, at least.
So let me ask the annoying question that every journalist hates, because you've gotten to the end and you've described you've described the problem really well, and then people are like, okay, and what do you do? And let me specifically ask a problem, because we're at the Federalist Society. In any marriage, and I sat next to a divorce lawyer on a plane in 2015. This story is going somewhere, I promise. And he said, we got to talking, and he said, America is like my clients who are in the really bad place where they're just at the point where they're like, oh, yeah, I will total his Porsche. It'll cost me $50,000, but he'll be even more unhappy than me. And the problem is that there's no way for a country to get a divorce. And if you're in that position, if you're married, maybe you think your spouse is 100% wrong, but you're going to have to fix the problem together. So how do we think about, we can say, stop. I agree in many cases, yes, stop attacking the court, stop with the personal attacks, stop trying to undermine legitimacy. You will miss it when it's gone. But what could we in this room do that would make this problem better other than shouting at the people who are doing it, stop?
So I guess I have two thoughts. I mean, to me, the best reaction to what happened to Judge Kavanaugh was that he became Justice Kavanaugh, and the Republicans picked up seats in the Senate. So you pull that, you lose ground, and that's good. Now, obviously, they haven't learned their lesson yet, and so maybe there needs to be more of that. The other thing I think people in this room have an obligation to do, actually, is to actually speak out about this stuff on a as much as possible, and do as much as you can to try to defend the institution, because it can't defend itself. They don't have press secretaries. There's like a little communications office that reports to the chief. It is not, believe me, equipped to deal with this level of personal attack on individual justices. And so it's our job as practitioners, and not just the people here, to talk to our friends that are nonpartisan, that are liberal, people like Jay, who thanks for coming to do this. It's great to have you here. I mean, that's awesome. To say that this is nuts. I mean, if you destroy the rule of law, you're not going to have a country anymore, and things are not going to work for anybody, including the people who are sponsoring the attacks. That's my take.
So I'll just be the egghead here as a person who teaches the law. When I teach the law, I just try to teach the law. I really just try to teach my students that there are sides. One of the most disappointing things that I've read about law professors saying, I just can't teach the law anymore. It's not real, and I feel triggered. I feel
That's only
like,
at Georgetown.
No, it's everywhere. There's New York Times articles about how I can't talk about constitutional law anymore because I just feel so triggered. I just teach the law. So you say there was this rule, there was that rule, and there's this method, there's that method, and what's the best method? I think the best thing we could do as lawyers, and as a law professor in particular, is try to just be rigorous in how we approach the law, recognize the diversity of approaches to the law, and understand that the people, the justices who are applying the methodologies that I like, are doing it with like ethically, rigorously, honestly. And then if you don't like it, say, I would prefer a different methodology. But as a professor, I try to understand my job is to just be a lawyer teaching law. And I worry that, especially in the legal academy, that is just too rare.
I'd never heard of the fragility of law students, so that's an interesting concept.
I'm not the fragility of law professors. My students are quite not fragile.
Really? Okay. Well, that's
Maybe.
unique. So,
That's just Notre Dame.
So I definitely think that conversations are the only way through, but I think what's really important is for people who disagree with the outcome of a case. So I was not pumped about Dobbs. I think it's really important for those people to speak out in a way of saying, it's not a crazy decision. Policy-wise, didn't like it. Happy to talk about reliance interests in the decision and why I disagree with that. But to start with a structure of, come on, Roe v. Wade was not the tightest opinion out there, and we can say that without the virtue signaling. Like, I'm sure people, is this being recorded?
I probably is.
Great. So I'll get a lot of nasty emails saying, like, you know, I'm not for women's rights, all those things, and it's missing the point, which is that if you actually do believe in these issues, you also can believe in the rule of law, and you can talk about them more intellectually, and you can actually give up some ground, and be honest about it. I think that's the best way to do it. It's really the losing side who has to be the one who's making the strongest case for it's still good we've got a Supreme Court that is making decisions, is writing it out in a reasoned way, and then we can discuss it. But it really is the obligation of the losing side more than the winning side.
Afterwards, I really want to ask you how you can have a longer than 9-month reliance interest on an abortion, but I will not derail this
Because people
panel.
move to states, and I don't know, because Dobbs is bad, okay?
It's the neutral position, as Justice Kavanaugh explained.
So, I mean, let me ask about that, because one thing, and I will say this is for journalism, that I was in an editorial meeting right before the pandemic, and I was talking about it, you know, how like young conservative and liberal journalists will drink together, and the actually young liberal journalists in the room looked at me like I had just suddenly sprouted another head. They had no idea what I was talking about. And I had moved to Washington in 2007 and done this, and there had been, in fact, you know, things got a little testy during Obamacare, so we had to seat our weddings so that the liberals and the conservatives were not next to each other. But still, people were cordial. They went to weddings together. And it seems like that doesn't happen anymore. And my understanding is that that also doesn't maybe happen so much now with lawyers either. Am I right about that? And then if I am right about that, how do you even have those conversations?
I'll go drinking with you anytime you want. I mean, Jay, you know, I've only been back in private practice for a couple of years. When you're in the government, you tend to hang out with people from your team, as it were, just because those are who your friends are. I don't know. I think the private bar is relatively bipartisan still. I think the bigger issue is that there's what seems to me a much greater fear than there was 25 or 30 years ago about speaking out on these issues. And so people at large law firms who you would think of as sort of deans of the bar are not doing what they would have done in the 80s and probably did for Earl Warren, I haven't checked, which is say this is not okay. And we're not going to destroy this institution because you're unhappy about a particular outcome. And I do think that would be important, in addition to going out and drinking together on a regular basis.
Is that, can
I mean, I walk through the Notre Dame at Commons. Notre Dame Law School students will know this every day because it's like a warm cut. It gets cold at Notre Dame, and you got to walk through the warm cut. And I see lots of law students sitting together, having conversations across ideological divides, and I think that's great. So maybe I live in Disneyland, but I think that's what we need.
I personally find it a lot more interesting to talk to people who experience the world differently than me. That's why I like speaking at these events, that it's, different language, different viewpoints, but I don't really agree that there's a lot of discussion going on. So, I mean, I'm a plaintiff's attorney, and plaintiff's attorneys, want to have this pack mentality, and anyone who's not a plaintiff's attorney is bad. And I basically stopped speaking at the plaintiff's attorneys conferences because it's just hell. It's just sorry, am I allowed to say that? Sorry.
You'll be blessed later. It's
okay. It's not terribly interesting when everyone's just saying the same exact thing. And when you actually get into substantive discussions, you realize that people actually have a lot more commonality. But your question is, how do you foster those substantive discussions? And I don't know, you're the law professor.
I mean, I do think the Federalist Society historically has been very good at fostering those discussions like we are right now, where we've got sort of a diversity on the panel of viewpoints and backgrounds. And that's a critical role for this organization to continue playing, I think.
Would it help if the court cleaned up its Ethics Act? Would it help if they promulgated a really tight new code?
Yeah,
or would it just be fodder for the war?
So I reject the premise that there's an ethical problem that they need to solve. I clerked there, I know some of them pretty well, and these are about the most cautious and prudent people you're ever going to encounter in real life. And so the idea that they're just like running around partying all the time on private jets or whatever, I
Not all the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes they write opinions.
I think like Justice Barrett's like having dinner with Jesse at her house most nights, but it's just silly. And so no, I think look, they've now said they're going to abide by the code that they've issued. I think doing anything more than that is just going to become grist for the mill. This idea that they're going to have the lower courts enforce it is a ridiculous idea. I've written about that, and it would not work, and it would upend the judiciary. And so no, I don't think they need to go further in the face of this bullying. Now, if Congress wants to pass an all-of-government rule that's going to apply to them, and it's going to apply equally, and it also perhaps includes Nancy Pelosi's stock portfolio, I think that's a conversation we could have.
The problem with all of this is just these gotcha moments, right? It's impossible to apply evenly. There's always the chance, like maybe Justice Barrett ate 3 shrimp at the tailgate instead of Jesse ate 5 shrimp. He had probably 20 shrimp at the tailgate. But it was a shrimp boil tailgate from New Orleans. But the problem with all of these codes is about disclosure, and it's just inviting these gotcha moments, and it's inviting unfair and unequal exposures of these things. And I don't know the answer, Megan. I really don't, because I don't think that we should. I'm not against ethics. I am against gotcha moments.
Well, let me suggest a couple things that could perhaps fix things, break things further, who knows? One is the obvious, right? Doing court reform, setting term limits. Why is this a bad idea if...
It's sort of unconstitutional.
Assume we do a constitutional amendment, because that will definitely happen.
Well, then we can have a different conversation.
Yeah. Well, but would it be a good idea if we did a constitutional amendment?
Well, it depends on what thing we're talking about, but
18-year term limits, staggered so that each president gets 2.
So,
2%.
So there's a very fundamental difference between a prospective 18-year term thing that applies to future justices and the current proposal, which applies to current justices. So it's really just the Alito Thomas Roberts Removal Act that we are currently talking about. I think things like that, or court packing, court expanding, they're just so goofy that all they're going to do is destroy the credibility of the institution on a prospective basis, because then the other side is going to come back and come up with their own thing, with the Jackson-Kagan Term Limit Act, and it's just going to be a race to the bottom. And the ultimate consequence is going to be that the political branches do not listen to the court anymore. I worked in the executive branch. We have a president right now who very much wants to do things like forgive student loan debt and put his opponent in prison. It is not hard to imagine a president who tells the court he does not care about their opinion, which, by the way, is how it works in most countries. Now, if that's the country we want to live in, fine. But I think the people that think that's going to be okay need to think awfully hard about what a President DeSantis or someone like that's going to look like if we don't have the court there to set the limits. I might think it's great, but the people who are pushing the stuff right now, I don't think would find that very enjoyable.
If the Constitution were set up where there were 18-year terms or something, maybe. I mean, we could find a lot of fault of that too, because then after the 18 years, the justices are going to cash in and they're going to take these expensive, these high-paying jobs. And no, yeah, hopefully that'd be great. I'm all for that. We're doing the Lord's work.
God bless you.
But yeah, I mean, all this stuff about let's change all the rules is very short-sighted, because we've got a Democratic president now, and then we won't, and then at some point the Republicans will have all three branches of the government, and this is where Democrats, and I'm speaking as one, sometimes struggle of understanding what the repercussions are going to be. But it's a disaster. You add a few more justices, and then the Republicans are going to do something else.
Well, I look forward to it as an example of exponential growth, where you just keep doubling the size of the court every time the presidency turns over, and eventually it's like everyone in the United States is a Supreme Court justice. Right.
It's like the Ninth Circuit.
Yeah.
So here is the other solution to which I am somewhat more partial, which is are we asking courts to do too much? Are we asking it to be a kind of super legislature that tries to resolve every hard problem? And I think that Roe was an example of that, right? This is a hard problem, we'll take care of that, now you can't talk about it anymore. And that it didn't resolve the problem. And I will say, with cases that I was sympathetic to, like Heller, I'm very sympathetic. I actually agree with the reading of the Second Amendment. I also worry that by putting these problems politically off limits, that with some of the free speech cases, which again, I agree with as an intellectual matter, but that by putting things like campaign finance reform politically off limits, that you're creating a situation where these sorts of attacks are inevitable. Because control of the court matters so much, because the court gets to tell the side it doesn't agree with, or the side that, that it is less sympathetic to, let us say. Gets to tell them that they can't do a bunch of stuff and that they're not even allowed to try to handle it politically.
Don't you think, Megan, that the problem starts a long time before Heller? I mean,
yes,
the court
absolutely.
So if you want to be Burkean or whatever, you want to say, oh, the court should just defer far more to the political democratic process, okay. But we're going to have to go back a long way to the 50s, the 60s. I mean, to say the court has usurped for itself this power.
Yes, I agree.
And it has made up a lot of stuff. So some of the stuff just needs to be unmade up. And then we can go back to democracy.
So can we lay out a blueprint? We're undoing all of these, and then we'll be done, and you can have it
Megan,
back.
that's why this is also sort of like Alice in Wonderland-like. I mean, all Dobbs did was take the court out of abortion.
Exactly.
And so, the idea that Dobbs was some power grab by the judiciary is totally crazy. They said, we're not going to be involved in this. You guys go figure it out. And what do you know? Many states have much more permissive abortion laws than they did before Dobbs. And some states have less. And that's, how the democratic process works.
I should say I favored Dobbs. I favored whatever it was going to be. I didn't know the name of it when I was writing Overturn Roe. No, for this exact reason.
Yeah.
Because it was the government taking something it was the court taking something out of the political process, and instead of resolving the issue, it had made it completely toxic. And I actually think what is happening now with all of its errors and contentions and everything else is the healthy process of communities handling a really hard problem on their own. I don't want to see Congress come in and make a national abortion law, or the courts say that is it a due process right to not, I don't
think that's going to happen for a while.
Right, I don't want the courts in it at all, precisely because I think putting these things off limits ends up in this place where the Senate and the presidency are increasingly, you're just voting for who's going to give you the justices you want, and then the justices give you what you want without you having to go through the democratic process. And it seems very unhealthy to me, but I'm also not a lawyer, and it's probably extremely naive.
I think Alita is done with us.
Well, actually, I just wanted to note that it is important to have a little bit of Q&A, so we should probably go
Oh,
to
yes,
some
I'm
Q&A.
sorry.
Yes.
Everyone has been too interesting. Can we turn to the, and of course I like to hear myself talk because I'm a journalist. Can we turn to the audience and get some questions? I'm sorry. I should have gone to Q&A sooner.
Okay. So I was a committee counsel for 14 years for Congress, and my view is there's usually a motive for things, and my sense is that the motive is very simple. There are many, many interest groups across the progressive spectrum who don't like the court, and the solution is to expand the number of justices and create a majority. The problem is the public doesn't like it, so you destroy the reputation of the court and you set it up so that when you get a majority, you can pack the court. So in answer to your question, I want your thoughts of, you said, how do we stop this? And the answer is we take away the option for politicians to pack the court. And most people in this room probably know that there's a constitutional amendment called the Keep 9 Amendment, which would say the Supreme Court is 9 justices, 200 members of Congress support it. And my question to each of the panelists is, do you think that it would be a good idea to amend the Constitution, to put into the Constitution that the Supreme Court of the United States shall be composed of 9 justices so there wouldn't be an incentive to destroy the reputation of the court to pack it?
Yes.
I guess so.
It's not going to happen.
9 isn't a
so-
magic number, but I guess so. I mean, I haven't thought that much about it, but yeah,
I'm just going to go with yes.
I'm with him.
All right, next question.
J.P.
And by the way,
Hogan.
we can't see you at all because these lights are blinding. so
Okay,
just-
J.P. Hogan, I've been writing on politics over 30 years. In 2007, I started writing full-time to defeat Hillary. But anyhow, you're talking about this. One thing you should bring up is Bill Clinton's post-Constitution. If you study what they were meaning by post-Constitution, they were basically voiding our protections from tyranny to make some changes. And when you start factoring that in, a lot of this against the court is things that the Clintons did that haven't been checked, and then it really gets complicated because Mueller would have been covering up for them after 9/11 on ways that.
Sorry, is there a question here?
The question is taking apart the Clintons' post-Constitution. If you study it and you study it as they were actually trying to avoid tyranny, our protection from tyranny, and what Trump ran into when he let Hillary go after lock her up. You can go to lockerup.biz. I have I was writing rap on the Constitution before Hamilton. But taking apart the Clintons, you answer a lot of your questions.
Thank you. Due to my irresponsibility with the Q&A, we have gone too long, so I'm going to, does anyone want to comment on that? I'm going to move to the next questioner.
Yeah, hi panel. I think we've seen with, I think it was mentioned on the panel about these gotcha moments that politicians are so often seeking out with these confirmation hearings. What is the panel's opinion on these confirmation hearings going behind closed doors, and whether that would solve things a little bit, by taking away the gotcha moments like asking Justice Jackson what is a woman and things like that, yeah?
That's a really good question.
I don't know why that's a gotcha moment, though. And I'm glad you asked that question because sometimes I'm worried that there's too much of a focus on the Supreme Court when, district court judges and the appellate judges have an incredible amount of influence too. And what we're seeing with the confirmation process is that it's a lot of kind of subtle virtue signaling and not a lot of substance. My favorite senator, who I disagree with politically when it comes to confirmation hearings, is Senator Kennedy, because he asked trial judges, questions like, do you know what a motion in limine is? And that matters to me. I'm in front of district judges. And what do I want first? I actually don't care if they're conservative or liberal. I care that they're efficient, that they're smart, that they're paying attention to law, and that they're decisive. I just needed to say that, so I used your question as an opportunity to say that.
Sure.
Now I want to answer it directly. I still think it should be out in the public. I think that's a better way. It's part of democracy. I just wish that it shifted to something more substantive, and we've gotten so far away from that.
For what it's worth, there is a second secret hearing where they talk about the background investigation that the FBI does. That is supposed to be where they ask you about, whatever, you got arrested when you were 21 or you have a traffic. That has historically been where these sort of very personal issues that bear on your fitness are ventilated for precisely the reason you suggest, which is that historically we have not wanted to destroy people's lives for having the temerity to want to serve their country. And I think that is a good process, and that the public hearing should be about judicial philosophy, the role of the courts, and all of that.
Yep.
Thank
you.
Unless you have, okay, next question.
Several of you complained about the media printing falsehoods about the courts and judges. Would a solution be to overrule New York Times versus Sullivan and hold them to account?
No, we're moving on to the next question.
Can I?
No, I will let that.
It is
So-
very ahistorical.
It is, I agree completely with Nicole about that, but I'll just offer one counterpoint. I tend to worry that that would have an asymmetric effect on the few media outlets that are still sympathetic to the way that we think about the world, like Fox is headquartered in New York. And so I tend to worry that we would just end up shooting ourselves in the head rather than getting Megan's less scrupulous colleagues.
I beg your pardon. We are a fantastic value at only $50 a year, I might add.
I think I use my neighbor's subscription.
Sir, you make me sad.
All right, do we have, sorry,
Yeah,
last question.
This has been a great conversation about the Supreme Court. I want to ask about district courts and circuit courts because they have even less of a defense apparatus around them. You have third-party groups fighting to recuse district court judges on all kinds of things. You have the government coming in and arguing that all these cases actually need to be decided in D.C. by the D.C. Circuit. So the attacks are not limited to the Supreme Court. And in fact, district courts have even more incentive to just say, fine, let somebody else deal with this because they can just send it to another judge, whereas the Supreme Court actually has to decide the case. What can be done there? How can we help bulk up the district court judges and the circuit court judges? And
I don't have any particular. I will say the Supreme Court doesn't seem super much motivated to decide a lot of cases these days. But I agree with you that that the court attacks go below the Supreme Court.
Tyler, for what it's worth, that is a new thing. This administration has been much more willing to attack the district court judges, raise venue, accuse plaintiffs of forum shopping than certainly our administration did. And it's some of my former colleagues that are doing it. And I don't know where that comes from, and if it's just a decision to be more adversarial to a out-of-control judiciary. But that's the kind of stuff that I think is very destabilizing. Like the Justice Department didn't used to do stuff like that, and it is very much inconsistent with the norms that historically governed it. So I don't know. I think they need to stop. One way to get them to stop would be for some people in this room to take over the Justice Department. Peacefully.
I'm going to give you the last word on that because you're...
I would suggest that forum shopping is not a new thing, and it's not just with the government. So, corporations, I know, yay, corporations. They
No, we don't like them anymore.
Oh, you don't?
Yeah, no, that's the next panel.
Good. So Facebook, who we all don't like, right?
Yeah.
Good. Facebook, puts, if you're going to sue Facebook in their contract of adhesion, you're going to do it in the Northern District of California. Awful decision by them because Northern District of California hates Facebook, but that was their decision. Plaintiffs' attorneys try to find the best venue for themselves. What I've noticed in my practice is district judges, the good ones especially, and everyone I go in front of is one of the good ones, they're not really terribly interested in a lot of gamesmanship, and I don't find that what's pulling at them is to not do work and send it to a different judge. So I understand the thrust of the question. I'm not seeing that, at least in my civil practice, in a way that's terribly concerning to me.
Well, thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you so much. And thanks to our audience for being nice and asking good questions.
Amazing moderator. We're going to take a quick break to switch out the panel and the microphones. And for those watching on the live stream, we will reconvene at 7:15 for the fireside chat. Thank you. fireside chat portion of tonight's festivities. Please take a seat so we can, out of consideration to our friends watching on the live stream. They're probably sitting there, and they don't even get a drink. All right. I will turn this back over to our intrepid moderator, Megan McArdle. The floor is yours.
Well, we got a roaring start. And since this is supposed to be a fireside chat, I would like you all to imagine that there is a beautiful fire here, that we are toasting some marshmallows, maybe making s'mores. So we have a very special panel here. We have the Solicitors General of Iowa and Ohio, and their bios are on the website. You can look at them there. And I'm just going to dive straight in by opening with the question that I closed with, which is, are we doing too much? Are we putting too much onto the courts? Are we pressuring them to solve issues that the legislature should be solving? And specifically, are we putting too much onto the federal courts? And Eric, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Sure. I think it's not necessarily that we're asking the courts to do too much, although I guess the question is who we is. But when it comes to the states, a lot of what we're doing is asking them to reallocate who's doing what away from agencies that have not been empowered by Congress to do what they're doing, to Congress itself to either authorize the agencies or to do it themselves. And I think in that limited role, there are tools in place that Congress has enacted that give the states the ability to make those challenges. I think that's normally pretty good. I do think that when it comes to broadly enacting social policies, there's a tendency to conflate, especially, but not uniquely among non-lawyers, like what is the best policy with what a court is actually able to do. And
So can you give me an example of that?
Sure. I think there was just a decision that came out of the Fifth Circuit, which is Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, relating to Texas's foster care agencies. And it's not an area in which I'm expert, but I was reading the opinion, and it sounded like the district court was really seeing itself as the superintendent of foster care policy for the state of Texas. And no matter how qualified or intelligent that judge is, that's just not what the role of a judge is. And so 15 years after that judge took on that role, the Fifth Circuit vacated or reversed and reassigned to a different judge to basically say, at some point, this has to have a resolution. There's not just an open-ended mandate to effectuate the policies that you think are right, even whether or not they're right. It's just not something that is the proper role of the courts. And I think when you're appointed to life tenure, there might be a tendency to think that I can do not very much wrong, and that sometimes can lead judges away from the humility that helps making being a judge the best thing that they could be.
No, we are not asking courts to do too much. The state of Ohio.
Robust response. I like
The state of Ohio is asking courts to respect and to, in many ways, serve as the physician for an out-of-joint separation of powers in this country. When I go to court asking for relief, it is because over a long period of disrepair and decline and desuetude, we have allowed our country to abandon many of its fundamental tenets. When we think about what it is that we want from our courts and why judicial independence is so important, why the separation of powers is so important, it makes me actually think of a Bible verse. And before you are too worried, it's from the part that we both agree on.
Thank God.
My Jewish friend here. Leviticus 19:15 says, "Do not pervert justice by showing partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great. Instead, do justice to your neighbors." Why do you have an independent judiciary? It's because of the insight that crowds don't always, through the democratic process, do a good job of adjudging right and wrong and what is just or not. And so I think when the states are going to court today, what we're mostly asking them to do is to fulfill their role, their discharge and to put back into place the disjointed separation of powers that we see at the federal level.
Are there places where you feel like things are better? Let me say this in a different way. Where are things better handled in state court, and where are they better handled in federal court? How do you think about separating those issues, which doesn't have to be the way the courts currently do, but where, because you guys think about that all the time, I would imagine, is what the right venue for various questions are. So how do you think about that problem, and how should we be separating that?
Yeah, I think to my colleague's excellent insight, that social policy belongs in the legislative branch. Actually, that's where the wisdom of crowds is very helpful. When you're prescribing rules that will apply prospectively about how we live together, that's what the police powers are for. That's why you have in Ohio, Iowa, top 2 Midwestern states.
Especially with 3 vowels.
Right, yeah, so we look at that and we say, the General Assembly is actually quite good at that role. It's well equipped. Those people in our state legislature, they live with their communities. It's a job with a salary. It's technically full-time, but it's not really enough to support a family, especially if you live like 3 hours away from Columbus. So most of these people live and work and abide by the rules that they create. That's excellent. What courts are not good at is setting those kinds of prospective rules. What they're good at doing is looking backwards and judging between cases and controversies, parties that have a concrete dispute about how that law cashes out in a given case. And because it is indeed case by case, the evidentiary deep dive that a trial system is, in fact, the best devised system of which I am aware to suss out the truth for limited, epistemically confined human beings like us. The trial system is the best system for that. So yeah, courts shouldn't be making social policy because courts are essentially backward-looking institutions. Legislatures should be making social policy because they're the ones who can peer out into the future and actually see what it will look like if that rule versus a different rule becomes the law.
And change it, right? I mean, a court also seems to me, again, from a layman's perspective, a very ponderous way to solve a social problem. On the one hand, yes, you can have one judge making decisions, but on the other hand, it's actually, once a decision has been made by a higher court, it's then quite a procedure to change it. And, legislation's not easy, but maybe easier than working your way up through 7 layers of appeal. So I was last night, because I'm an incredibly glamorous person with an incredibly glamorous job. There I was sitting in my chair at 10 p.m. And as one does, reading the amicus briefs in US v. Scrimeti. And this strikes me as some of what you are saying, right? It is the plaintiffs asking a court to decide a contentious social issue rather than the legislature.
Yeah, I think it's often, or it's even worse than that in this case, because we're dealing with very unsettled experimental science. This case, for those of you that aren't familiar, is about 25 states, half the states, have passed laws that prohibit permanent sex change treatments for children. And activists across the country, and in some cases joined by the Biden-Harris Department of Justice, have sued those states seeking to have those laws, enforcement of those laws enjoined as unconstitutional. So to put in perspective some of the specific things that these laws address, cross-sex hormones, permanent drugs that would lead to inability to have sex for adults, and then of course there's surgeries for minors. And there are a few different one of these cases. The one in question here came out of Tennessee and in the 6th Circuit, where Ohio is. I'm in the 8th Circuit, not quite as glamorous, but better corn. And so
also very good pie, I find, in Iowa.
Excellent pie. We have a wonderful Mennonite population and the farmers market every week. And let me just also say, if you're interested in working in Iowa, we are always hiring. So please, always feel free to reach out. But going back to Scrimeti, which is the name of Tennessee's Attorney General, they were sued. They went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and basically their argument is that, one, their law does not need to face heightened scrutiny because they're not discriminating on any protected class basis. If you're a boy or a girl, you're not able to access this permanent life-altering treatment under Tennessee law, treatments that have not yet gone through all of the full experimentation and process they should, and that this law is rational, has a rational basis. And nothing in the Tennessee law at issue here says that a consenting adult can or can't do anything. I know there's a lot of controversy in the media now. I believe Vice President Harris, when she was running last time, wanted to let detained illegal aliens in prison get sex change treatments and
Yes,
in an
the
ACLU.
ACLU asked
And so
her if she
this
would
is
do that, and she said yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of very contentious side issues, but here the question is, the science is not settled no matter what the activists say, and the state is saying, hold up, until we understand that this is actually safe and beneficial for kids, we don't think this is right. And people sued and are asking the courts to make a final decision. And it's not clear to me at all why they think that, one, the courts will agree with them, and so far, almost uniformly, they haven't. And I think that's an excellent example of, across the board, judges with very different demeanors and approaches to the law have come to the same result, which is that a state can ban an experimental treatment for children that might have permanent life impacts. And I'm hoping that the Supreme Court is going to also leave that question to the states to decide.
So, I mean, here is where I see a little bit of tension, although I think this tension may be entirely self-interested, but bear with me. So, I mean, I take your point that trials are actually a really good place to get information. And for me, the reason I'm reading these amicus briefs is that this trial has been fantastic for journalists who write about this issue, of whom I am one. Because getting information out of these organizations has been extremely difficult. And Alabama especially has just gone postal on some of these groups and is putting out a lot of briefs. And that's, I think, good for the public discourse. And yet at the same time, I sort of don't want this case to exist, because I agree with you that this is a question for the states to legislate, and that we shouldn't, the suit should never have been brought. It should have been shot down earlier, because these are just the sorts of questions that should be handled by the legislature. Is that even a tension, or am I making
At the risk of jumping in, I just also really want to highlight, when we're talking about the importance of an independent judiciary, that the Alabama case in particular is an egregious example, based, again, on just the allegations and what the court has said, of these activist groups trying to effectively gerrymander their way out of the judge they got.
So can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
So they filed their lawsuit. They got assigned a judge that they thought would not be sympathetic because he was appointed by President Trump, and basically tried to file another complaint and get in front of a different judge and basically avoid the judge that they had been assigned, all to avoid this one specific judge in a way that, at least according to the show cause order, I believe, some people have said may be unethical, and I think certainly reflects poor judgment. But in that case, they did not get out from that judge's purview. And then the judge granted them relief. He was reversed on appeal, but they worked so hard to avoid what they were sure was going to be an unfair judge, who then gave them a hearing, agreed with them, gave them the relief they sought, and then in the end, like every other court to look at the issue, they lost. And now a lot of this discovery, this explosive discovery, is coming out of that litigation because, you know, they're stuck in court and they sued, and now they have to deal with the consequences. But sorry.
Yeah, well, that story has been paralleled in state court in Ohio, actually. Because Tennessee was a little ahead of Ohio in adopting a law that protected children in this way from permanent life-altering surgeries, cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, the effects of which are deeply uncertain, the benefits of which are certainly unclear, and the risks and downsides are something that can be evidence-based. They sued in state court, and of course they forum shopped, the ACLU in this instance representing a pair of plaintiffs, to find a blue county where judges are elected by a very sympathetic electorate. And again, they prevailed at the preliminary injunction stage. The law was set on ice statewide over our objection. My attorney general said we're going to court about this. We're going to do fact-based discovery. We held a 5-day trial on the merits. We had expert testimony. We brought in some of the same evidence that Alabama saw. And this judge in a blue county, at the end of that trial, reversed himself, let the law go into effect, and now that law is in effect in protecting children in the state of Ohio while it's on appeal in the state court system. And so what's particularly galling me about the U.S. versus Scrimeti case is I actually think that there are some poor motives. At least there's enough evidence to give rise to a suspicion of the motives here. If you're the president of the United States, you can go to Congress and say, you know what, I think there should be a one-size-fits-all legislative rule with respect to transgender issues. And setting aside all the potential other federalism, separation of powers, First Amendment issues that might be involved in that, there is a channel in the Constitution for nationwide solutions, one that is accountable to the people and in which the states have, through their senators and representatives, a way to have input. And they didn't do that. They went to the court system. Why? Is it perhaps that they suspect that the court system will say, hey, wait a minute, we don't want to be involved in that issue? And maybe they suspect that in certain quarters, that will discredit those courts in the eyes of the public. Perhaps this lawsuit isn't so much about creating a nationwide rule, where I think their prospects of success, God willing, are very low at the US Supreme Court. Perhaps it's more of a battering ram against the independence of that judiciary to basically throw, as ancient siege engines would, like diseased animals into the courtyard of the people that you're attacking, right? Let's put a hot-button social issue on the court's docket again and again and again until half the country thinks that even if it just simply applies the law, the headlines that will be written about it is, Supreme Court is against transgender youth. That's going to be the headline no matter how the court rules, if it rules in favor of democracy.
So let me circle this back then to the larger theme that we were discussing in our last panel. And do you see other cases where you think that is happening? I mean, the Scrimeti and these issues around transgender kids, I think, are the most toxic issue to me, looking at it from the media. But you guys are looking at it as lawyers. You are seeing both, not just the cases that have political controversy, but the cases that have big kind of lasting legal implications for all sorts of things that percolate out. So where else do you see cases do you see cases elsewhere where it feels like it's well poisoning? It is an attempt not so much to get a result, but to undermine the legitimacy of the institution from which you are seeking the result.
Yeah, I mean, one example that immediately comes to mind is the fact that not only Alabama, but Virginia has been sued over maintaining their voter rolls, just the basic task of ensuring that people who have moved have up-to-date information. People who are not citizens don't have to worry about someone voting in their name. And what could possibly be the reason for that? Well, either you want non-citizens to vote, you want non-residents who have moved out of state to vote. I don't think that's it. Maybe it's just to churn up some mud and to put additional pressure on the judiciary. I mean, as an officer of a state government, I work for the Attorney General. I get to bring lawsuits sometimes and be the lawyer representing the state. I do think a little bit about what kind of pressure this is going to place on our institutions. And I think one of the things that has lacked in our political discourse is the resource that institutions constitute. They are a public good. Maybe I'm too much of a UChicago person here right now, law and economics, but these
As a graduate of UChicago, I approve.
And this is an all UChicago panel at this particular moment, so look at that.
All the best.
Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and cold winters. And I'll say this, though. The resource that our institutions, they're an inheritance for us. And if you assail them, if you tear them down, it's not so very easy to rebuild alternative institutions. Look at the right. I mean, people on the conservative side of the aisle have been trying their best to build a parallel set of institutions, as many institutions have been, in their judgment, captured by an ideological viewpoint. And it's not an easy thing to do. There are a few examples, like the Federalist Society, where I think it's very effective to build an alternative ecosystem. But that is no substitute for the Constitution's judicial power residing in a Supreme Court that isn't itself a political football that descends into the maw of negative partisanship every election cycle.
And sort of also just thinking about how these lawsuits work, it's not infrequent that someone sues the state. They often choose the highest profile statewide officer to be named as the defendant in the lawsuit. Before we actually get served with the lawsuit, the fundraising email goes out. Look at this good thing we're doing, suing the evil Republicans in the state. And then, we eventually, hopefully, often win the lawsuit. And then, the same people sue us again and send out another fundraising email. And I think that that's not by any means all of these groups, but, maybe this is my inner U Chicago coming out. How much money can be donated to groups that just keep suing, and maybe they get a sugar high of a preliminary injunction and then it gets vacated, and I guess then they get more donations and they can do it again. And all I can say is I have a deep and abiding affection for a lot of the activist groups in our state. In the last year, we defended successfully our heartbeat abortion law, our law removing inappropriate books from schools. All these wins wouldn't be possible without the activist groups that sue us and tee it up for appellate courts to create binding precedent going forward. And they're my best partners.
I think we've all been there. It's midnight. You're a little hungry. You just want to go get a preliminary injunction.
Yeah.
Sit down in front of a Netflix for a little while.
If you want it at midnight, you have to call the court and tell them it's an emergency motion. You got to file it, before 5 p.m.
Do you feel like, do you see things getting worse or better on this front? When you look at your own states, your own practice?
I would say the frenetic pace and the extreme noise. I root for The Ohio State University. If you've ever been to the Horseshoe, it's a great experience. It's very loud. Whenever you're sort of like right on the goal line, the fever pitch noise of the crowd, I feel like that's sort of the political moment that a lot of people feel that they're living in, where you're right on the goal line. From my perspective, it's those who want to permanently erode constitutional norms on the goal line of someone who says maybe we should not permanently erode constitutional norms and fending them off after failed attempt at a pass again and again. But we're close, right? And that's why it feels like things are such high stakes. If you think you're about to win forever, if you think that maybe you're about to lose forever, and you can decide for yourself which side you think you might be on, but most of America feels like they're on one of those two sides at this particular moment. It's dark, right? Turns out, though, democratic political life together is not a football game. It's not one where it ends. You actually have to go and be friends and neighbors with each other afterward. And so I think de-escalation here is only possible if you start to re-enable the judiciary, the legislative branch, the executive branch at the federal level, and then the division between state and federal authority. Those are the shock absorbers for that frenetic energy.
Is part of this that everything is nationalized now? This is a problem for us in the media where nothing's a local story, everything is a national story. And so I would assume that many of the groups in your state are getting donations from people who did not know those groups existed 10 or 15 years ago. And that also the cases then end up on social media in a way that they would not have 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And is that a problem? Is it a benefit because it is creating opportunities for you to win cases?
Yeah, I think, I guess a couple points there. One is I find that often, more often than not, when we're litigating against someone, even when it gets pretty heated, the opposing counsel tends to be fine. There's not there's not the same acrimony there as, maybe in the media, maybe even with comment from opposing counsel. But, when you're actually in the courtroom or leading up to court, for the most part, things work smoothly. And I am always interested to see if some of the negative polarization that you were describing bleeds over from the press and the media that really turn up the temperature on some of these cases into the courtroom. And I think for the most part it doesn't. But, there's always a worry. There's a saying about a judge, and if I were to hear this about a judge that I liked and respected, I probably wouldn't love it, but sometimes the judges might care a lot about what people think. And I think that this was expressed, there was that old phrase, the greenhouse effect, not about climate change, but about the old New York Times reporter, Linda Greenhouse.
Oh, gosh,
and the idea is that some judges cared a lot what she wrote in the New York Times. And I think back to before I was born, but I've seen the headline. I think it was an early Eighth Amendment case with Justice Thomas, and she wrote a headline, the Supreme Court's new youngest and cruelest justice. And it did not seem to shake him at all. And I think that, she probably picked on him, but that wasn't the target of her pen because she didn't think that that would affect what he would do. And I think part of this is judges that want to be, in polite society, they want to be out with their friends, especially in some of these cities that maybe trend a little more liberal. They don't want the front page of, nationwide publications like the Des Moines Register saying they're a bigot. And I think that that is a tool that the media, who tends to often have a view on a given case, knows that they can use to their advantage to keep that temperature turned up. And
We
I
are
do think
always
that that's a
completely
problem.
objective. I don't know what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Just totally disinterested, fighting for justice and liberty across the land. What issues are people not talking about at the state level that they should be talking more about outside of your states?
Well, it's tough because a lot of the issues that we are dealing with end up being talked about a lot. But I think that maybe one sort of hovering, overarching issue is just like, what are these agencies doing? And like one example of that, and this has gotten a lot of attention, although maybe not as much as it should have, the Biden administration was working on a third attempt at loan forgiveness after the Supreme Court twice told them not to. And
At first, you don't succeed.
yeah, this third attempt, in the second attempt, some money went out the door before the preliminary injunctions saying this is illegal, you can't do it, happened. And the courts did not order them to claw that money back. So the lesson that the Biden-Harris administration learned was, we need to plan a blitzkrieg, and we need to make sure that this loan forgiveness goes into effect, and that money gets out the door before a court is able to wake up and issue an injunction. And they were trying to make sure that hundreds of billions of dollars got out the door within 72 hours, specifically to avoid judicial review. I think that more and more creative attempts to violate norms, ignore Supreme Court precedents by the current administration, it's something that now is just happening so frequently. And there are so many errors in the rules that they're rushing out to avoid potentially getting overturned. In the second loan forgiveness, there was a whole section about how this would only cost $150 billion because of the successful case that they won at the Supreme Court in Nebraska against the United States, which was their loss in the first case. They had issued before they wrote the rule for the second case, and they just didn't update it. So each time they have these errors in these rules, they know they're there. These are hundreds of billions of dollars. They're trying to get it out in an election year. And people are kind of like, well, that's not that interesting because, we can focus on, the guy we really don't like as much. And no one wants to talk about the president at all because he's not even running. So I think that's a real problem is these agencies are really getting aggressive, kind of because maybe they don't think that they're going to have that long to be aggressive. And what we learned in the Trump administration is once a rule, even an illegal rule, goes into effect, it takes a legal process to undo the illegal rule, which is also, I think, really going to slow things up if the situation changes and trying to right the ship.
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. So just on the topic of judicial independence more broadly, I think you can categorize the types of threats to judicial independence into three basic camps. There are political threats, there are cultural threats, and then there are the threats from within. The political threats are the ones we've mostly been discussing tonight. One branch of government says, hey, we're going to put pressure on the courts, we're going to go after them. The cultural threat, I think that comes from the culture of many institutions that are behaving like battering rams against the reputations of individual members of the courts, both at confirmation and then relentlessly after confirmation. The third threat is when judges brush back from the plate themselves, doing something that they're ill-equipped to do, which is predict the political consequences and fallout of ruling without fear or favor. And the reason that you want an independent judiciary is that a judiciary that is lifetime appointed, you can't change their pay, they have tenure protection with a strong check, but only for impeachment for bad behavior, is that that's the one place where you're pretty much guaranteed you're not going to have ordinary agency capture problems, issues where the special interest groups sort of take control of an agency and have them turn the opposite of square corners, squiggly, strange, roundabout corners.
One last quick point on that. The New York Times does like an end-of-term roundup, and they list the important cases, all sorts of issues, but just like if you click on the arrow to expand, one of the like 3 bullet points is a public relations survey of what the public thinks of the decision. And to think that, you know, it's like 73-27. Let me tell you, there is no case at the Supreme Court in which 100% of people have an opinion. There is almost no case in which most people have an informed opinion, because these are, you know, like, you want to tell me that 64% of the American public thinks that Jarkizi finding a right to, like, you know, go to trial instead of an administrative law judge? Like, good luck, but that's how it's presented.
I have been really impressed by the number of people on Twitter who turned out to be experts on Chevron deference. I had no idea.
Yeah, and the only expertise on Chevron I have is when I go to the gas station, and in Iowa, it's Casey's, the great breakfast pizza.
So I'm not going to make the same critical error I did before and not leave time for Q&A, but let me ask you the final question, which is, what are the best and worst things about being a Solicitor General that no one knows about?
Well, let me just make this pitch. I see a lot of young lawyers in the room. My fellow last year, who's now at Williams and Connolly, had 2 Iowa Supreme Court arguments, and she would have had an 8th Circuit argument if she wasn't practice barred. We have so many arguments on important, high-profile cases. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of discovery, so you won't be able to like do a lot of document review. Although maybe, you know, in the case of Alabama, it sounds like they had that there. But there are so many opportunities to go out to serve the people of the state. I grew up in Connecticut. I'm an Iowan by choice. I love living in a state where I can defend the people, where I have a court system. You know, I'm 50-50 at the Iowa Supreme Court. I don't win every time, but it's a legitimate court. They apply the law, and sometimes they agree with me, and sometimes they might get it wrong. But they're doing an amazing job. And I mean, some of this attacks on the legitimacy of the court trickles down. We have one justice voted to uphold a state law protecting fetal heartbeat in the state of Iowa. And there is a concerted campaign to get him non-retained on the basis of a substantive vote in a case. And the only reason they're just targeting him is he's the only one up for retention that voted what they would say is the wrong way. I think that kind of attack on the judiciary, trying to undermine its legitimacy, which is what a lot of the posts and articles about this are doing. They say he voted wrong on one case, so you need to make sure he doesn't even have a job, that he can't be a judge anymore.
What does that do to your practice? When you are up in front of these, do you worry about that? Do you worry about this is going to make cases go the wrong way for you?
You know, so far in Iowa, I don't think that they have changed their votes on this basis, but it is something that I worry about, and not just for for state judges with retention elections. I worry about federal judges who have lifetime tenure and no backbone. And I remember, we went to UChicago for law school. There are people with tenure there. And, when bad stuff is happening on campus about free speech or any of these things that they're passionate about, behind closed doors, they know I'm conservative, right? They'll say, you're so, get out there, defend, whatever. And the second it comes to defending any of this in public, it turns out life tenure doesn't come with a steel spine. And I see the same problem with the judiciary, and I just hope that whoever's picking judges is picking judges that care more about getting the law right than they do about being popular. I think that is the key insight into what it takes to be a good judge of any kind, but especially federal judge. And, to me, it's just mind-boggling that you could have life tenure and not have courage. I was worried when I was in law school and I was doing some conservative stuff, I was worried they were going to slime me and I wouldn't be able to get a job at all, right? And I still did it, and I was, not a life-tenured federal judge, so.
Last word.
Well, it's a great job being a Solicitor General. The Chief Judge Sutton says it's still his favorite job that he's had. He's said that publicly and shared it to me several times. And, as far as the fellowship goes, the Simon Karras Fellowship in Ohio, I see my former fellow there. He argued 4 times, including once at the Sixth Circuit, twice at the Ohio Supreme Court, and once in an intermediate court of appeals. And so getting to stand up.
Making me want to go to law school.
Getting up to stand up in court and be able to say, this is Elliot Gaiser on behalf of the state of Ohio, where I was born and raised, the state that raised me, made who I am, to be able to give back to them in some meaningful way by trying my best to provide this piece of sovereignty in our constitutional fabric has the best representation that it could have. It's the best job. And to Eric's point about needing rebar in your spine, I think we should select for that when we're thinking about who should run for state court judges, who should be appointed to the federal judiciary. Are you able to live up to the idea that you will not be partial to the poor and you will not show favoritism to the great? If you can do that, then I think maybe the only thing better than being the top advocate for a state in appellate court might be being a judge who has that kind of fortitude, planted their feet in the ground the way that they should.
Well, I think we have 2 candidates here on stage. So I'm going to throw this open to the audience for Q&A. If we have...
Hi, I just want actually to ask a question based on the last 2 comments. You posited that perhaps it's not a good idea for the judges to be voted out of office based on their decisions. Of course, Iowa had 3 justices voted out of office when they found the right of gay marriage. And so I just wonder, is it really such a bad idea to have justices, so long as they do have that spine of steel, to have that check on them, either through retention elections or through partisan elections? Now, my personal, my state usually has retention elections, and on principle, I always vote no, because I don't like communist elections when there's only 1 candidate. So even if I like the judge. But if you're actually taking their decision into account, is it really such a bad idea to have the judges accountable to the public? And if they have a spine of steel, they should be willing to lose their job if they think they made a right decision.
Well, I'll say this. I think a judicial philosophy is a good basis on which to vote for or against a candidate for judicial office. And states in the federal system are different. One of the reasons you need life tenure and you need an independent judiciary of a certain kind at the federal level is that that institution will mediate disputes between the states and between the states and the federal government. And so I think that you have a heightened concern there. Now, as far as state court elections go, I think democracy is the worst form of judicial selection except for all the other ones. And when you see in many of my fellow states a system like, I think they call it the Missouri Plan, yeah, it does the state of Missouri's name dirty to call that the Missouri Plan. But the idea that you have basically the local bar, which is very politically one-sided, constrain the governor's appointment to just a few people that they find to be palatable, and it's like 4 flavors of activist judge. That system is worse than having what Ohio has now, which, this is the second election that we've had, where you have partisan ID attached as information for the voters among the different justices who are running.
I guess just super quick, I think that a judge should rule the right way without fear for losing his or her job. I think that is what their job is. I think there's a difference when the attempt to non-retain a judge is based on reasons and rationales outside of what the system itself contemplates. And so if we had partisan elections, I would probably vote for the judge to which I had, that I thought was going to apply the law best. And if there was a judge that I thought had a judicial philosophy that was inimical to interpreting the Constitution and the state laws in a way to their oath, I would vote against retaining that judge, even if there were no ethical violations or anything like that. And maybe that's ultimately what the people saying non-retain are trying to argue, but that's not what they're arguing. And I just try to take people where they are, and where they are seems to be, we don't like this one correct decision, so we want to non-retain you, and I just don't find that very persuasive.
We have another question from the audience.
Gene Meyer. I wondered on the Skrzynecki case, I heard somebody say, I don't know the details, that the argument, one of the arguments the other way was, well, this is parents are the ones making the decisions about what their children should do. And I will admit I wonder about some of the people who are making that argument, whether they would apply that in other situations. But nonetheless, it's a perfectly clear argument. What do you have that argument been made? What do you make of that?
Yeah, so that argument is live in the Ohio State Court case. And so what we said in our filings, what I said in argument in the Intermediate Court of Appeals last month was that parents do have rights to direct, in general, the upbringing, care, education, religious impulses of their children. But that's not an absolute right, and it has to be defined not at the perch of the ladder of abstraction, but with some measure of specificity. And then the Glucksberg test applies, where you need to look not only to whether or not you can contemplate a system of ordered liberty without such a right to a certain type of medical treatment, but also whether there's a deeply rooted history and tradition of such a parental right. And there is no deeply rooted history and tradition of parents doing either sex change surgeries for minors or them doing, getting access to having a positive right to a type of medical treatment that the state has generally proscribed. And I think the positive-negative liberty split is actually quite important here. It's one thing to say, I think that it violates my rights of conscience for me or my child to take this type of medical treatment that is generally required of those who would attend, a school, for example. It's quite another thing to say, I have an affirmative right to a doctor giving me this type of treatment, even if the state has said it's not generally safe or effective for children. And there is no history or tradition of that latter component. And so the rights of parents over children are not absolute, and I don't think anyone would argue for them to be. And so the question is, where do we draw that line? And the line has to be looked at in terms of ordered liberty deeply rooted in the history and tradition of our common law and our Anglo-American legal tradition.
Can I ask a follow-up? We've had situations where states on both sides of this, we've had California saying if you can get your kid here, we'll terminate your spouse's parental rights. I think that did not ultimately pass, but it was being considered. And we've had Texas saying we're going to stick CPS on you if you take your child out of state in order to get treatments that we have deemed to be illegal. How should states handle those questions of I'm going to spirit my kids somewhere else in order to either do or not do the treatment that I think is best for them?
So I think with a lot of these cases, you get these highly contrived scenarios that focus on one question, but there is actually a rich history and tradition of the type of rights and responsibilities that, for example, if you have two parents that disagree about what to do with a child relating to a healthcare decision, how to handle that, and run away to another state to get medical treatment is not in that tradition. And so, I understand that, on the other hand, I know that there's been some reporting about what Texas is doing, but ultimately, the question here is not about kids getting permanent life-altering treatment. There's a long history of how the United States deals with parental rights over their children, and that gives you the answer the vast, vast majority of the time. And when it comes to states passing, like California, laws that, or I guess not passing in this case, laws that seem very much out of the mainstream, that sort of try to take something out of that long history. Like, we've been a country for hundreds of years, but our legal tradition goes back even further. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a point at any point in time, one where like one parent can like effectively kidnap the child from the other parent to undergo medical treatment. Like, and so no matter that it happens to be the trans issue, which is highly controversial, I don't think that that creates an exception to just like, let's treat this the way we've always treated this type of dispute.
We have another question, it looks like, over there.
Tim Rosenberger, also Ohio. It seems like a lot of the pressure and energy around state court races comes from the reality that in the last several years, they decide redistricting cases, they decide which votes are going to be counted, they decide how those votes are going to be counted. You have these sort of bizarre think pieces like, whoever wins this Wisconsin Supreme Court seat will determine who the next president is. How do we sort of take that pressure off of our state courts? Should we encourage them to be more like the U.S. Supreme Court, where they just say, you know, fight it out, whoever happens to be able to stuff the ballots in will be fine, we're not getting involved? Or is there some way to sort of insulate them or muscle them up so there's less of this national politicization on the state court races?
I think it's tough to answer that question in a truly comprehensive way, because at some level, when you have a culture at odds with itself, which is what we find ourselves experiencing in the United States, it becomes challenging to say, well, there's going to be no place in which that pressure comes to bear. I think state courts are maybe second only to federal courts the worst place to be the outlet for all of that. General assemblies and legislatures seem to be much better positioned to do it. And one thing that general assemblies and state legislatures can do is they can act to define some of the jurisdiction of their state courts. You know, the Ohio Supreme Court has original jurisdiction in mandamus over many election disputes. In fact, Mark Elias sued over our drop boxes rule last week, another in the long line of zero Mark Elias, you know, long number on my side of the column, because the Ohio Supreme Court has been given the authority to do that. You need an answer quickly, and it's usually a question of pure law, and in that particular instance, they gave us precisely the answer. Now we can run our election going forward. And without having like multiple lawsuits in multiple courts of common pleas filtering up and disrupting the entirety of our system, I think that kind of model can be something that the Brandeisian laboratories for experimentation in the states could maybe give us some insight on.
Yeah, to go back to the U Chicago thing, we only had one F word. It was fair. And I just think, especially with election law, so many people have such strong views on like what is fair, and those are often very removed from what is the law. And some of the problems arise when people want something that they say is needed or necessary that isn't the law as written. And I think one place where courts maybe find themselves in hot water is when these very sympathetic plaintiffs and organizations are bringing these claims that ask to violate the law, and they go along with it. And that doesn't happen super frequently. I think that became a really acute issue during COVID for a lot of what seemed like, you know, exigent circumstances at the time. But, you know, as with all things, you know, there's a saying, bad facts make bad law. Same with good plaintiffs, right? You know, you might get a really sympathetic person, and, you know, we're all Americans, we love voting. You know, I came from Chicago before Iowa. You vote early and often, right? You vote as many times as you can.
Get the dead relatives out.
Yeah.
Make it a party.
Yeah. And so, like, I understand the empathy there, but, you know, maybe to put myself on the other side from some extremely qualified, smart people, like, I don't think empathy is the most important thing in, like, applying laws. I think, you know, being able to, you know, read the law as written is, which, you know, dovetails nicely into one of the Federalist Society's 3 tenets. And I just think that in election law, that's one area where some folks have really gone awry.
We are getting the hook, it looks like. Thank you so much for an amazing panel. Really a pleasure. It's great to meet you too.
Yeah. Thank you all for staying late into the night. We are a little over. If you haven't already checked the QR code at the bar, that will actually take you to one of the best Substacks on cocktail mixology. I encourage it.
High endorse.
That too. And I do want to thank our fantastic moderator, Megan, and our fireside chat. And thank you all for joining us for a really just a fantastic program. We're adjourned.